Autumn arrived at Ravensworth Hall the way a landlord arrives at an unpaid door, without knocking, and without any intention of leaving. It came through the beech avenue first, stripping the trees one leaf at a time as if counting what was still owed. It crept along the low stone wall that separated the kitchen garden from the moor, and it settled at last against the west wing of the house, where the panes were oldest and the mortar had begun to blush with lichen. Inside the great house, no one lit the drawing-room fires until the third afternoon of the week, and by then the cold had already made itself at home in the corridors, in the linen presses, in the throats of the maids who moved from one duty to the next in silence, their breath ghosting a little in the pantry air. The Falcon was awake. He was almost always awake in the last hour before dawn. His name was Selim, and he had lived at Ravensworth Hall since Adrian Halloway's 12th summer, when the boy had been given the falcon by his uncle Cedric with a warning that no bird chosen by a Halloway had ever, in 7 generations, chosen a Halloway back on the first offering. The boy had waited. The falcon had settled. That was that. Selim's mews stood a little apart from the stable-yard, in a low stone building whose slate roof caught the first gray light and held it, softening it, so that the interior always seemed lit from within by a candle no one had thought to blow out. On this particular October morning, the falcon opened one eye, then the other, and turned his head with the slow, ceremonial precision of a creature to whom no one had ever successfully given an order. He listened. The kitchen wing was already awake, though the great house above it was not. Somewhere between the scullery and the still-room, a young woman was carrying a copper pail of water across a flagstone floor without letting any of it slop over the rim, and it was the absence of that small, overflowing sound, the sound that most maids made and had ceased to notice they made, that first registered against the falcon's attention. He did not, being a bird, understand what he was noting. He noted it anyway. Her name was Alys Merrow. She was 22, small-boned, brown-haired, gray-eyed, and she wore a plain gray servant's gown that fell to the floor with sleeves buttoned to the wrist, a white linen apron pinned at her shoulder, and a cap so close-fitting that it left only the pale oval of her face and the neat parting of her hair uncovered. She had come to Ravensworth Hall 5 months earlier, from a family cottage 2 villages over that had run through its last coin the winter her father died. She had come with a single reference letter, a mended satchel, and the settled understanding that being useful was the only currency she had left. By the time the first upper housemaid rose, Alys had already scoured the kitchen hearth, laid the fires in the breakfast room and the small dining parlor, drawn water for the housekeeper's tea, and slipped out through the scullery door with a scrap of yesterday's bread crust in her apron pocket, because there was a particular half-lame cat that lived under the icehouse steps, and no one else at Ravensworth had ever bothered to notice her. She did not, on that morning or on any other, stand in a doorway waiting to be seen. She had been placed, from her very first hour in the house, into the invisible category, pillar-side rather than parlor-side, the girl 1 steps around in the corridor rather than the girl 1 steps toward, and she had accepted the category the way a cottage accepts weather. She did not fight it. She lived under it and did her work. On the far side of the kitchen garden, she paused. The mews door stood a little open, as it did every morning at that hour because the falconer's boy propped it for airing before the master's dawn visit. Alys was not supposed to be near it. She was not supposed to be anywhere except between the scullery and the linen room and the servants' stair. But the wind was cold, and the crust in her apron pocket had gone hard, and the half-lame cat had not, in fact, been at the icehouse steps this morning. She stopped in the mews doorway. She looked at the falcon. The falcon looked at her. Neither of them, in that moment, understood that they had begun something. Alys stepped back, quietly, closing the door as if she had never opened it. She returned to the kitchen the long way round, past the scullery, past the still-room, past the housekeeper's parlor where Mrs. Baird was already stirring a spoon in a cup of chocolate and reading, for the 3rd time that week, a household bill she could not entirely reconcile. Alys did not stop to speak. She did not, in fact, speak to anyone at all before the household bell rang for 8 o'clock. A little later that morning, when a groom brought Selim out onto the falconer's block in the yard for his hour of gray air and light, the falcon did what he had done every autumn morning for 6 years. He sat. He watched. He turned his head once toward the scullery window, where a small brown-haired maid was passing unaware, and his gaze remained on the window a fraction of a second longer than the groom, who was busy adjusting a dress, had time to notice. Autumn arrived at Ravensworth Hall the way a landlord arrives at an unpaid door. It had come to collect something. It did not yet know from whom. The letter came by the London coach on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday afternoon the whole of Ravensworth Hall knew, as houses always know, that the master had at last been forced to consider his own marriage. Adrian Halloway, Duke of Ravensworth, was 31 years old, tall, dark-haired, gray-eyed at a slightly lighter gray than Alys Merrow's own, clean-shaven, with the kind of composed and slightly weary face that some men achieve by carrying too many other people's obligations too well for too long. He had inherited the dukedom at 23, buried an uncle at 26, buried a distant cousin who had been the last other Halloway male of his generation at 29, and had spent every year since standing between the estate and the various men in London who believed a duke without a duchess was a duke who could be persuaded, pressed, or eventually married off. He read the letter twice in his study. It was from his grandmother, the Dowager Lady Halloway, and it was, as her letters always were, both affectionate and unmerciful. You will marry Adrian, and you will marry this season. I have permitted you 6 years of grief and estate work and quiet, which is more than any Halloway woman has ever permitted any Halloway man. Lady Isolde Marchmont will be at the Foxcombe Assembly on the 12th. She is beautiful, she is well-connected, and she is prepared. I do not say she is right for you. I say she is available. The distinction at your age and at the halls no longer matters. Come to me before the 12th. Adrian set the letter down on the desk. He looked at the window. Outside, autumn was doing to the parkland what autumn had done every year of his childhood, and it occurred to him with a small, dry, private honesty that he had been putting off this precise Tuesday for nearly a decade. He had run out of Tuesdays to put it off with. He rose. He walked, without hurrying, to the mews. Selim was on the block, hooded, still. The groom stepped back at the master's approach, and Adrian lifted the falcon onto his glove with the ease of long habit. He walked out through the kitchen garden path, a path he did not, as a rule, take, and stood for a moment with the falcon on his fist, looking at nothing in particular. He did not, at that moment, see Alys. She was inside, folding sheets. But Selim's head turned toward the scullery window a second time, and the second time Adrian noticed. He did not remark on it. He simply noted it the way a landowner notes a fence that is beginning to lean. By evening the household was informed, by that osmotic servants' hall method by which all great houses inform themselves before the master formally announces anything, that his grace would leave for the dowager's residence at Foxcombe the following morning, and that the Foxcombe Assembly on the 12th would very likely produce, before Christmas, a Duchess of Ravensworth. Lady Isolde Marchmont arrived in the county 2 days before the assembly, in a barouche whose polished lacquer caught the light so aggressively that even the beech avenue seemed dulled by the comparison. She was 22, tall, golden-haired, blue-eyed, and habitually beautiful in the way of women who had never, in their lives, needed to be anything else in order to be attended to. She was accompanied by her brother, Lord Percival Marchmont, whose face wore the small, permanent look of a man who has decided, in advance, that everyone he meets will disappoint him and is quietly grateful to be proven correct. They were guests of the Dowager. The Dowager did not, in fact, like them. She had learned, however, at 84, that dislike was a luxury and that grandmotherly duty was not. On the 11th, Adrian rode down to Foxcombe. The Dowager received him in her small blue morning room with the sort of composure that made the morning room feel like a court. She looked at him a long moment before she spoke. "You have come," she said. "I am relieved. I had begun to suspect you preferred your falcon to any woman I might produce." "He is easier company," Adrian said. "He is a bird, Adrian. That is not company. That is convenience." Adrian did not smile. He looked at his grandmother, and she looked at him, and after a moment she softened very slightly, the way stone softens when the light on it changes. "I will do what is required," Adrian said. "I know you will," she said. "That is the problem. I did not raise you to do what is required. I raised you to do what is right. If you cannot do both this season, do what is required first and pay for the difference later." The assembly was held the following night at Foxcombe's small but proud assembly rooms, whose chandeliers had been washed for the occasion and whose musicians had been paid, for the occasion, slightly better than they were usually paid. Lady Isolde wore a gown of pale gold silk that had been chosen to catch every candle in the room, and did. Lord Percival stood at her elbow with the air of a man managing an investment. Adrian danced with her twice the necessary count. He spoke to her with the necessary courtesy. He observed, without any particular pleasure or displeasure, that she was beautiful and that she was empty in the specific way of women whose mothers had spent 19 years teaching them to be beautiful in the belief that beauty would be enough. He was not cruel about the observation. He simply made it. At some point in the second dance, Lady Isolde said, "They tell me you keep a falcon, your grace." "I do." "How amusing. Perhaps I shall meet him." "Perhaps," Adrian said, "you shall." He returned to Ravensworth Hall 3 days later with an understanding, not yet formal, that Lady Isolde Marchmont and her brother would be received at the hall the following week for a private visit. The kind of visit whose outcome, in Regency drawing rooms, is usually decided before anyone arrives. The household prepared. Rooms were opened, aired, dressed. Mrs. Baird, who had been housekeeper at Ravensworth for 21 years and who did not, on principle, complain, permitted herself, in the corridor outside her parlor, one small, precise sigh. Alys was given the west corridor rooms to prepare, the guest suite that had not been opened since Adrian's uncle's funeral. She did it without commentary. She did it well. She did it in the same gray gown, with the same close cap, and no one who passed her in the corridor addressed her once by name. The Marchmonts arrived on a Thursday, and on the Friday in the mews in front of Lady Isolde herself, who had asked, in her gold-lit voice, whether the Duke's celebrated falcon might come to her glove. Selim did what Selim did. He did not go to her. He went, instead, low over the yard, banking with the ease of a bird who had already made his decision 300 yards earlier, and he came to rest, cleanly and without any ceremony at all, on the shoulder of a small brown-haired maid who was crossing the yard with a basket of freshly picked apples, and who had not, on that morning or on any other, considered herself part of the day's events. For a long moment no one in the yard spoke. Lady Isolde had lifted her gloved hand. It was still lifted. She lowered it slowly, in the manner of a woman who has just discovered that the room has been quietly rearranged without her being told. Alys stood perfectly still, because that was what one did when a bird belonging to one's master had made a decision one did not understand. She did not turn her head. She did not look at Selim, though she could feel the light weight of him on the shoulder seam of her gray gown, and she could feel the small, careful pressure of talons that had chosen not to break skin. She did not speak. Adrian said very calmly, "Miss." Alys turned her head, then only enough to answer without displacing the falcon. "Your Grace." "Do not move," Adrian said. "He will come off in his own time. He has never done this before." Lord Percival, who had followed his sister into the yard with the air of a man expecting to be bored, laughed once. It was a short, unpleasant sound. "A remarkable performance," he said. "The Ravensworth falcon appears to have poor eyes." Lady Isolde said nothing. Her face had not moved. But something behind her face had, and Adrian, who was accustomed to noticing such small displacements in the faces of ambitious women, noticed it and stored it. Selim, after a small ceremonial pause, opened his wings, took 2 shallow beats of them and rose. He returned to Adrian's glove with the calm, unhurried air of a bird finishing a piece of business he had been meaning to complete for some time. Alys curtsied, which was the correct thing to do, and, at a small nod from Mrs. Baird, who had appeared at the kitchen door with the expression of a housekeeper who has known a crisis was arriving for some weeks and is only mildly gratified by its punctuality, she withdrew. That evening, in the small library, Adrian and the Dowager spoke. "You saw," Adrian said. "I saw," the Dowager said. "He has never done that." "No." "With Lady Isolde standing at the block." "Yes." "With the maid at 40 paces, carrying apples." "Yes." The Dowager took a small sip of her tea. She looked at him across the rim of the cup. "You are not," she said, "going to marry Isolde Marchmont." "I am not," Adrian said. "No," the Dowager said. "You are going to do something else, and it will be inconvenient, and I will be blamed for it in London, and I will bear that. Tell me what you propose." Adrian was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and level, the voice of a man who has arrived at a decision the way autumn arrives at a house. without knocking, but not without consideration. "I will offer the girl a settlement," he said. "Protected settlement. Legal. Signed. I do not know her. I have not spoken with her twice in 5 months. But I will not marry a woman my Falcon refused in front of a servant. You will not offer her a settlement, Adrian." "Grandmother, you will offer her a marriage," the dowager said. "Because you are a Halloway, and because your Uncle Cedric taught you that a Halloway does not, under any circumstances, put a woman in his house on any footing that any village in this county could, without being unfair gossip about. You will offer her a marriage, and it will be transactional and quiet, and you will pay for her people's cottage debt and settle her sister-in-law's widow pension and give her, in exchange, the protection of your name and your Falcon's odd, immovable opinion. That is what you will do." Adrian looked at his grandmother a long time. "Yes," he said at last. Alys was called into the housekeeper's parlor the next morning at 9:30. Mrs. Baird stood at the window with her hands folded. The dowager sat in Mrs. Baird's small chintz chair. Adrian stood at the fireplace with his hands behind him. Alys curtsied. She waited. Adrian said, "Miss Merrow, I owe you an apology. Yesterday's incident placed you in a position you did not ask for. Your Grace need not apologize. I was in the yard. It was permitted." "It was permitted," Adrian said, "but it was not fair. And I have come to a decision that I would like to put to you plainly, because I do not think you have been spoken to plainly under this roof, and because I do not intend to begin our acquaintance with a lie." She waited. She did not, at this moment, understand what was coming, but she had learned very young that when a person of consequence began a sentence with "I have come to a decision," the wisest thing a servant could do was wait for the whole sentence to arrive. Adrian said, "I intend to ask you to marry me." The dowager, from the chintz chair, said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent thing she had said in the room. Mrs. Baird's hands, at the window, tightened once and then loosened. Alys felt the floor of the housekeeper's parlor become very steady, in the way floors do when the world above them decides to move. She heard herself say, at a pitch just barely above a whisper, "Your Grace." "I will not," Adrian said, "pretend it is a match of long acquaintance. It is not. It is a settlement in the form of a marriage. That is the only form of settlement that will, in this county, in this decade, protect you. If you refuse, I will still pay your family's debts. That is not a condition of the offer. It is a duty. You may go home to your mother in Foxcombe tomorrow with the debts settled and nothing further required of you. That is the first part of what I am saying." He paused. He did not, at any point in the paragraph that followed, sit down. "The second part is that, if you accept, I will provide for you a small settlement in your own name, a signed and lawyer-witness provision that cannot be revoked by any Halloway after me, so that whatever else follows, you will not, in this life, be dependent on any man again for your bread. That includes me. If you accept, and if a year from now you cannot bear it, you may leave and the settlement remains yours. I will name terms. You may name terms. We will negotiate them, if you wish, this afternoon. That is the second part." He looked at her then, and his voice, which had been the voice of a man reading a document, dropped by half a note. "The third part," he said, "is that I do not know you. But my Falcon does. He has never chosen a shoulder in 6 years that was not mine. I am not superstitious, Miss Merrow. I am, however, observant. Yesterday my grandmother sat in that chair and told me that a Halloway does not do what is required at the expense of what is right, and I would rather begin the wrong marriage for the right reason than the right marriage for the wrong one." He stopped. Alys, at 22, in a gray servant's gown with the sleeves buttoned to the wrist, standing on a rug in a housekeeper's parlor, understood that she had just been offered a life. She did not, in the moment, understand which life. She understood only that the offer had been made cleanly, and that she had, for the first time in 5 months, been spoken to as though her answer mattered. She said, "May I have until this evening, Your Grace?" "You may have until Monday, Miss Merrow. This evening will be enough." The dowager permitted herself, at the corner of her mouth, one small, precise, private smile. She did not, at that moment, tell either of them what she had already known, which was that Alys Merrow had been raised in a cottage 2 villages over by a mother whose only advice, in all her 61 years, had been, "Never accept the first offer without a term of your own." Alys spent the rest of the morning folding linen. She thought while she folded. She thought without hurry, because she had learned very young that thinking without hurry was the only kind of thinking that ever actually reached its own conclusion. At 6 o'clock she was called back into the small library. She had, this time, one term. "Your Grace," she said, "I will accept the offer as it stands, with one thing added. If at any time in this marriage I ask you to leave a room, you will leave. I will not lock a door. I will only ask. That is my term." Adrian looked at her a long moment. He did not, in the moment, smile. He said, "Agreed. And to it I will add one of my own, which is that if at any time you ask me to sit down in a room, I will sit." She inclined her head. It was, in that small library at 6 o'clock on an October evening. A bargain struck. They were married 11 days later, in the small parish church at Foxcombe, on a Thursday morning of thin grey light, before the vicar, the dowager, Mrs. Baird, and 2 witnesses hired for the purpose from the village. Alys wore a plain gown of dove-grey wool, high-necked, long-sleeved, floor-length, with a small collar of white linen and her hair pinned close beneath a modest bonnet. She carried no flowers. She did not, at any point during the service, look up at the beams of the church, because she had been raised to believe that a woman who kept her eyes on the floor before God was a woman who was less likely to lose her balance. Adrian wore dark grey, a plain waistcoat, no ornament beyond his signet. He did not speak more than was required by the vicar's prompts, and when he spoke evenly. The dowager sat in the front pew with her hands folded and her mouth slightly softened at one corner. The vicar, who had married 3 generations of Halloways and who had, in his own quiet way, expected this particular marriage never to happen, permitted himself the small vanity, when Adrian slid a plain gold ring onto Alys's finger, of pausing a fraction of a second longer than the service required, so that the moment could settle in the church before it was lost. Selim was not at the ceremony. He was at Ravensworth Hall on his block, hooded, still. He was, however, as Adrian would learn from the falconer's boy the following morning, unusually alert and had, at approximately the hour the vicar had pronounced them man and wife, opened his wings once and folded them again without any apparent reason. They returned to Ravensworth Hall by carriage. It was a short drive. They did not, in the carriage, speak. Alys sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance. Adrian sat opposite her with his gaze steady on the window. Neither of them, at any point in that drive, mistook the silence between them for anything other than what it was. It was not intimacy. It was not hostility. It was the silence of 2 people who had, that morning, signed a document and had not yet learned what came after. By nightfall, Alys Merrow, who had risen at 4 every morning for 5 months in a scullery, was Alys, Duchess of Ravensworth. She was shown to a suite of rooms she had, 12 days earlier, been dusting. She did not, on that first evening, sleep well. Adrian did not sleep at all. The first weeks at Ravensworth Hall after the marriage were the coldest weeks Alys had known in her life, and the cold had almost nothing to do with the weather. The house did what great houses do when they have been asked, in a single week, to accommodate a duchess whom every one of its 97 servants had, 3 weeks earlier, called by her first name. It rearranged itself around her, formally and without warmth. She was moved out of the servants' corridor and into the west suite. She was measured, by a woman brought up from London, for a wardrobe she had not asked for and did not know how to want. She was addressed, by every under-housemaid and every footman, as Your Grace, and ever Your Grace arrived at her ear with the small, invisible pause that servants place before a title they have not yet forgiven the wearer for holding. She did not, on any of the first 14 mornings, come down to breakfast. Breakfast was brought to her on a tray, by a maid whose name she still knew and who did not, any longer, meet her eye. Alys thanked her by name each time. The maid did not, in return, use hers. Adrian rose at 6. He rode out at 6:30. He returned at 10:30. He worked in his study from 11 until 3, took cold meat and bread at his desk, rode again from 3 until 6, dined at 7, and worked in the library from 8 until 11. He did all of this precisely, as a man does who has decided that precision will do the work of feeling until feeling arrives on its own. He and Alys dined together, at first, at the long formal dining table in the state dining room. The table sat 16. They sat, by ceremonial arrangement, at its two extreme ends. She at the foot, he at the head, separated by a length of polished mahogany so long that a footman could, without any exaggeration, take a step and a half between one of them and the other. They did not, at that table, speak more than 4 sentences a meal. 2 were good evening. 2 were good night. Alys understood the table. She understood the corridor. She understood the pause before your grace. She had been placed, from her very first hour as Duchess, into a new invisibility. The invisibility not of the pillarside girl, but of the wife whom nobody in the house yet believed. It was a different invisibility. It was, in some ways, harder. But she had been well trained, by her 22 years, in the discipline of living under a category rather than fighting it. She lived. She did her work. She had, however, no work. That was the sharpest cold. She had, all her life, moved through her day with a copper pail in one hand and a folded sheet in the other. She had, all her life, known, from the moment her feet touched the floor at 4 in the morning, exactly what the day was for. Now the day arrived at 9 on a tray, and left at 11 on the same tray, and the space between the two was a suite of 3 rooms in which she was expected to be a duchess and did not know what that word required of her hands. She began, quietly, and without asking anyone's permission, to make herself useful in the only way she knew how. She mended a pillowcase in her own suite on the 3rd morning, because she saw it torn and could not, being Alys Merrow, walk past a torn pillowcase, and the maid who found it mended the following afternoon returned it to the linen room with a small, silent frown. Alys mended a 2nd pillowcase the 5th morning. She unpicked and reset a badly stitched hem on one of her own new gowns the 7th evening. She walked, on the 9th afternoon, down the west corridor to the still room and stood for a long moment at the door, and then, because no one was in it, went in and washed and rearranged the herb jars along the top shelf, which had been standing in the wrong order for a great many years, and left before the still room maid returned. Mrs. Baird noticed. Mrs. Baird, at 59, had been housekeeper at Ravensworth for 21 years and had, in that time, developed the particular kind of observation that goes with keeping a great house running, the observation that misses nothing and comments on almost nothing. She said, at the end of the 2nd week, in her small parlor, to a first housemaid who was about to spread a piece of gossip about the new Duchess, "She is not idle, Sarah. She is not idle at all. Be careful with what you say." Adrian did not know. Adrian was writing. Adrian was writing. Adrian was doing everything a duke could do to fill the hours in a house where a woman he had married in a housekeeper's parlor was living in a suite 3 corridors away and eating breakfast alone from a tray. He did, however, on the 11th evening, look up from his soup at the far end of the long dining table and observe, without comment, that his wife's dove-gray dinner gown had a small, precise mended patch at the wrist that he did not remember any of the London seamstresses having placed there. He did not, at that dinner, speak of it. He did, however, at his desk at 11:30, sit for some minutes without opening any of the papers he had come to open. Selim, meanwhile, did not settle. The falconer's boy Tam, 13 years old, small, freckled, quick, the eldest of 5 and by far the most conscientious, reported to Adrian on the 12th morning that Selim had, on 3 of the last 5 dawns, turned his hooded head, once, precisely, toward the west wing of the house. It was not a movement a bird made without cause. Tam did not know what the cause was. He reported it anyway, because his father had taught him that a boy who does not report what he does not understand is a boy who will never be permitted to learn. Adrian thanked him. He gave him, from his pocket, a shilling. Not a whole shilling, but a whole silver piece nonetheless, and told him to continue to observe. He did not visit Alys's suite. He did not, in that first fortnight, cross the west corridor. Alys, in her suite, did not weep. She had been taught very young that weeping did not, on any day in the calendar, actually rebuild a hearth or hem a sleeve, and she had accordingly saved her weeping for the small hours when it disturbed no work. She did not weep in the fortnight. She did, however, on the 15th morning, sit for some time at her window looking down at the yard, and she saw, without meaning to see it, Adrian mount his horse and ride out under the beech avenue, and she saw the falcon on his glove, and she saw, in a small, unadorned way that she did not try to prettify, that the man she had married was a good man and a lonely one, and that a marriage founded on a bird's opinion was going to require, from both of them, more than either of them yet knew how to give. That evening, at the long dining table, at the moment when the footman was ladling soup, Alys said, very quietly, in the plain voice she had used all her life, the first sentence of 5 that she had spoken to her husband since the vicar had pronounced them. Your Grace, I have unpicked a badly set hem in the linen-room curtains. I hope that was not out of place. Adrian looked up. He did not, on that evening, smile. He said, it was not out of place. He looked at his soup for a moment. He looked back at her. Thank you, he said. The next morning, without any announcement, the small round breakfast table in the morning room, which had stood, since Adrian's uncle's death, folded against a wall, was quietly set up and laid for 2. Mrs. Baird, having decided this on her own authority, said nothing to either of them about it. She simply set it up. She then went about her day. At 8 the following morning, for the first time in her tenure as Duchess, Alys did not receive her breakfast tray in her suite. She received a note, brought by a maid whose name she knew. It said, in a plain hand, the morning room, if you would. She went down. Adrian rose when she entered. They ate together. They did not, that first morning, speak of anything more than the weather and a mended hem. But they ate at a table small enough that a footman could not, without effort, take a step and a half between them. The cold in that hour did not lift. It began to be listened to. The thaw at Ravensworth Hall did not arrive as thaws in stories are said to arrive, with a sudden run of warm days, or a decisive scene, or a great confession spoken across a rug. It arrived the way real thaws arrive in the English autumn, 1 degree at a time, with intervals of returning frost, and by so many small increments that neither of the 2 people undergoing it could, at any single moment, point to the moment it had begun. Alys, having accepted the small round breakfast table, began, without any negotiation about it, to leave her suite an hour earlier each morning. She was not idle in the extra hour. She wrote, at a little walnut desk in her sitting room, 3 letters, 1 to her mother in Foxcombe, 1 to a widowed neighbor, 1 to the vicar, enclosing small sums of her own money for a specific purpose in each. She dressed herself, more mornings than not, without the assistance of the London maid, whose services she found, and gently said she found, more useful in the afternoons. She read, for half an hour before breakfast, from a battered copy of Cooper that had been her father's and which she had brought with her in the mended satchel. She did not, in any of these mornings, tell Adrian what she was doing with the hour. Adrian noticed, without saying so, that his wife had begun to arrive at the breakfast table with the composed and slightly warm alertness of a person who has already worked before 8 in the morning. He recognized the look. He had it himself. He did not, however, comment on it. The first act of competence Alys performed that Adrian himself witnessed occurred on the 17th morning of the marriage, at the round breakfast table, when a footman set down a small silver rack of toast that was, by the standards of every Halloway breakfast for 6 generations, indefensibly undertoasted. Alys glanced at it. She did not say anything to the footman. She waited until the footman had withdrawn to the sideboard. She lifted the rack quietly in her own hand and carried it back to the sideboard and, without visible instruction and without any particular fuss, placed the 2 slices back over the small brazier the sideboard maintained precisely for this purpose, adjusted the tongs, waited 2.5 minutes by the small ormolu clock on the mantel, and returned to the table with the same rack, now containing toast the color and texture the Halloway breakfast had, unbeknownst to anyone at it, always required. Adrian, at the head of the small round table, watched this without speaking. He said, after a moment, you were a housemaid here 5 months ago. Yes, Your Grace. You were, in fact, one of the maids who laid this fire. Yes. Adrian looked at the toast rack. He looked at his wife. Alys, he said, and it was, in the record of that marriage, the first use of her first name by him, spoken in a voice that was neither a command nor a formality. If you would prefer to eat toast that was toasted correctly the first time, you may say so, and it will be. I would prefer that, yes. Then it will be. The following morning the toast arrived correctly toasted. Alys did not comment on it. Adrian did not either. They both, however, permitted themselves, she at her plate, he at his, an almost invisible fraction of a smile at exactly the same instant, and they each, in that fraction, understood that the other had smiled and did not draw attention to it. Over the following 10 days, the small acts multiplied. Alys, in a walk through the kitchen garden on the 19th afternoon, noticed that the herb beds along the south wall had been planted in a rotation that had been badly recorded and was, as a result, running 3 species short for the winter stillroom. She spoke to the head gardener, not as a duchess giving an order, but as a woman who had, all her life, planted herbs in a small cottage garden 2 villages over, and she suggested, tentatively, a corrected rotation for the following season. The head gardener, who had, on principle, disliked the marriage, listened. He said very little in return. He did, however, 3 days later, write down the suggested rotation in his own ledger. Alys, on the 22nd morning, found in the library, which she had permission to enter because Adrian had, at the small round breakfast table on the 20th, told her in an even voice that the library was hers as much as his, a slim volume of English falconry notes that had been misshelved between 2 volumes of estate law, and she moved it, gently, to its correct place beside the 2 other falconry volumes on the 3rd shelf. She did not tell Adrian, but he saw, that evening, that a book he had been unable to find for 3 years had returned itself to its proper place, and he understood, without being told, whose hand had done it. Alys, on the 23rd evening, noticed at dinner. They were still, at that point, dining once a week at the long formal table, out of a sense of ceremony that neither of them had yet quite dismantled, that Adrian favored his left hand slightly on cold evenings, and that the cuff of his right sleeve caught on his signet when he reached for his glass. She did not comment. She did, however, the following morning, ask Mrs. Baird whether a small alteration might, at the Duchess's expense from her own settlement, be made to 2 of the master's evening shirts. Mrs. Baird, who had noticed the cuff problem for 11 years and had never mentioned it, said, "It might, Your Grace." The alteration was made. Adrian did not, that week, notice it in words. He did, however, sleep 3/4 of an hour longer on the following 2 Sundays, which even he, at his desk on the Monday, could not entirely account for without acknowledging that he had been more comfortable. The Falcon, in that same fortnight, moved once. Tam brought Selim to the Mews block at dawn on the 25th morning. As Alys crossed the yard, she now crossed the yard in the mornings, because she had asked, and Adrian had agreed, that she might oversee the small kitchen garden herself before breakfast. Selim, on his block, without any prompting at all, opened his wings and folded them. Alys stopped. She turned. She curtsied, a small, exact curtsy, in the direction of the Falcon. She did not smile. She said quietly, "Good morning, sir." Tam, at the Mews wall, coughed to disguise a laugh. Selim, having received the courtesy he had apparently been waiting for, settled. Adrian was not in the yard to see this. Tam told him at 11. Adrian, at his desk, did not, that day, open the correspondence he had come to open. He sat for some minutes with his hand flat on the blotter and looked at nothing in particular, and something in his chest that had been, without his knowing it, folded very tightly since his uncle's death 6 years earlier, unfolded 1/4 of an inch and did not, that evening, fold back. That night at dinner, at the small round table, now nightly, the long formal table having been by mutual and unspoken agreement retired for the season, Adrian said, "I understand you were introduced to Selim this morning." He introduced himself, "Your Grace." Adrian. She looked up. "When we are at this table," Adrian said, "I would prefer Adrian. If you would." Then Adrian. "Thank you," she said, after a moment, in her plain voice. "He is a very serious bird." "He is," Adrian said. "He was chosen by my uncle for me when I was 12. He has been a serious bird for 19 years. He has good taste in shoulders." Adrian did not at once smile. He then did. It was the first time in 8 years that anyone at Ravensworth Hall had made Adrian Halloway smile at a table. Neither of them that night spoke of it. But the following morning, when Alys came down to the small round table at breakfast, there was, at her place, folded neatly beside her plate, a plain gray linen glove, hers and only hers, cut and stitched by the falconer's boy at the Duke's private instruction the previous afternoon. She did not put it on that morning. She did, however, keep it. On the 26th morning Alys did a thing that, in later years, both of them would trace back to as the true beginning, though neither of them recognized it as such at the time. She walked, before breakfast, into the small side room off the kitchen corridor that had, since before Adrian's grandfather's death, been called the still room only by courtesy, because it had, in fact, ceased to be used as a still room some 40 years earlier and had, in the intervening decades, become an unlabeled storage of half-empty jars, unfinished linens, and a small bank of copper pans that no one had polished since 1791. Alys, who had been in the room 3 times in 5 months as a housemaid and had, each time, felt the small mute grief of a room that had once done useful work and had been allowed to forget how, tied on a plain white apron over her dove-gray wool morning gown, rolled her sleeves back to precisely the buttoned cuff, no further, and began, without asking anyone's permission, to sort the jars. She sorted them by contents. She sorted them by age. She sorted them by whether the herb inside was, in fact, still an herb or had, by the slow patience of forgotten shelves, become only a memory of one. She did not throw any of them away. She placed the useful jars along the top shelf in the order they had once, 40 years earlier, been placed by a housekeeper whose handwriting on the small paper labels she could still, if she squinted, half read. She placed the empty jars on the middle shelf, washed and dried and ready. She placed, on the bottom shelf, the small bank of copper pans, polished in half an hour with a piece of chalk and a rag, and the plain conviction that a copper pan that had been permitted to be dull was a copper pan that had been permitted to feel unloved. Mrs. Baird found her at 7:30. Mrs. Baird did not, at that moment, say anything at all. She stood in the doorway with her hands folded, and she looked at the room she had, for 21 years, walked past twice a day and never entered, and she saw the room had always meant to be, and she said at last in a quiet voice, "Your Grace, would you like some tea before breakfast?" "Yes, Mrs. Baird. Thank you." Mrs. Baird brought the tea in a plain cup. She did not, that morning, use the word "Your Grace" with the small invisible pause. She used it plainly, the way one uses the name of a person one has, at last, decided to know. That evening at the small round table, Adrian said, "Mrs. Baird informs me that a still room has appeared in a corridor of my house where there had, previously, been only a storage room. She reports that she was not consulted. She was not, Adrian. I did not ask. She reports that she is pleased. I hoped she might be. So am I." He looked at her over the rim of his glass. He said, "Alys, if there is any other room in this house that has been permitted, by long habit, to forget what it was for, and if you have views on the matter, I would like, over the course of this winter, to hear them." She considered. She said, "The nursery. The West Wing nursery. I have not, of course, been in it. But Mrs. Baird tells me it has not been opened in 19 years. Adrian did not, for a moment, answer. He was quiet the way a man is quiet who has been asked a question he has not, in 19 years, permitted anyone to ask him. He looked at his plate. He looked, then, at his wife. He said, "It has not been opened in 19 years because it was, at the end of my mother's life, the room in which she preferred to sit, and after her death my father closed it, and after his death my uncle did not open it, and after my uncle's death I did not either. It has been closed, in effect, for a reason. I do not, however, know if the reason is still a reason." Alys said, "You need not decide tonight." "No, I need not. But I would like, over the course of this winter, to think about it. That is all I ask." He looked at her some moments longer. He said, without any particular emphasis at all, "Alys, you have been in this house 8 months, 5 as a housemaid and 3 as my wife, and in that 8 months you have quietly repaired more of it than the previous 4 occupants together. I have not, before tonight, said so. I say so now." She looked down at her plate. She said, in her plain voice, "Adrian, it is not repair. It is only attention. Anyone in the house could have done it. It is only that no one was asked. You were not asked either." "No, but I was permitted. That is different." He did not, that evening, answer her further. He did, however, at 10:30, when the fire had burned down and Mrs. Baird had retired, sit for some minutes with his hand flat on the small round table looking at nothing in particular, and something in his chest that had been, without his knowing it, folded very tightly for a second time since his uncle's death, unfolded another 1/4 of an inch and did not fold back. The following week Alys began, at Mrs. Baird's careful invitation, to sit in the housekeeper's parlor for half an hour each afternoon to review the household accounts. She did not, in that half hour, take any decision that was Mrs. Baird's to take. She did, however, ask questions, the questions of a woman who had, all her life, run a very small household on very little money and who understood, from the inside, exactly which economies were small ones that mattered and which were large ones that did not. She noticed, in the third afternoon of these half-hours, that the household had been paying, for 7 years, a monthly sum to a coal merchant in Foxcombe whose deliveries had, for at least 4 of those 7 years, been arriving 15% short and whose bill had been paid without correction because no one whose duty it was to correct it had, on any of the mornings on which it needed correcting, been in the yard to weigh a cart. She pointed this out, gently, to Mrs. Baird, and without any suggestion of blame, and by the following Tuesday the coal merchant's contract had been renegotiated at Adrian's own instruction and the household saved, on the following 12 months, a sum equal to the entire wage of the under-falconer. Adrian, when Mrs. Baird reported the saving to him, said only, "Please inform the Duchess." It was her observation. Mrs. Baird did. Alys did not, on being informed, take the credit. She said, "It was Mrs. Baird's ledgers that showed it. I only had the freedom to read them." Mrs. Baird looked at her across the small parlor. She said, "Your Grace, if you will forgive me, that is not, in this house, a small freedom. It is the largest one you have yet been given, and you have used it. I do not, on principle, praise. I am praising." Alys did not, on principle, receive praise well. She did, however, on that afternoon, permit herself to receive it, because it had been given by a woman who did not give it. The change of table, when the household finally noticed it, was noticed all at once and by everyone. Mrs. Baird, on the evening of the 28th day of the marriage, went into the state dining room to inspect the sideboards and found that the long formal dining table, 16 chairs, mahogany, the length of the room, had, that afternoon, by the master's own explicit written instruction, been dismantled at the 2 extending leaves, reduced to its original small round center section, and moved out of the state dining room altogether into the smaller morning parlor, whose windows looked onto the kitchen garden. The small round center section was, in fact, only a little larger than the round breakfast table. Seated, comfortably, 6. Seated, intimately, 2. Mrs. Baird permitted herself, in the empty state dining room, the second small precise sigh of her tenure. It was, this time, a sigh of relief. That evening, for the first time, Adrian and Alys dined together in the morning parlor at the small round table, with a low fire, 2 candles, and no footman at the sideboard because Adrian had, that afternoon, given the sideboard footman the evening off with pay. Alys wore a dove-gray wool dinner gown with long sleeves and a high collar of white linen, and her hair was pinned simply. She did not, on entering the room, look at the table. She looked at Adrian. Adrian rose. He said, "Alys." She said, "Adrian." They sat. The dinner was plain, a clear soup, a roast fowl, a dish of buttered parsnips, an apple tart, a small piece of cheese. It was the sort of dinner Alys had cooked, 20 years earlier, at 7 years old, for her father when he had been ill. It was also the sort of dinner Adrian had, 12 years earlier, eaten at his uncle's table on the last quiet evening of his uncle's life. Neither of them said either of these things out loud. Both of them, over the course of the meal, understood that the other had, at some point, eaten a very similar dinner in a room where a very serious thing had happened, and that the room they were in tonight had been arranged, by whichever of them had first said the word round to Mrs. Baird, precisely because a round table did not have a head, and did not have a foot, and did not seat anyone at the extreme end of anything. They spoke at that dinner of small things. She told him about the herb rotation. He told her about the roof of the west wing, which had needed slates for 8 years and would, next spring, receive them. She told him about the vicarage's kitchen chimney, which needed sweeping and which she had, at her own expense from her settlement, arranged to have swept the following week. He told her about Selim, who had, that afternoon, taken a lure at a longer distance than he had taken it in 3 years. She said, "He is proud of himself." He said, "He is." She said, "So am I." He looked at her and did not answer. They finished the meal. The fire burned lower. Adrian, at the small round table, took a very quiet breath and set his wine glass down. He said, "Alys, there is something I have not told you." She waited. "When I offered you this marriage," Adrian said, "I offered it as a settlement. I said so. I meant it. I meant it because I thought it was the most honest thing I had to offer. But I have not been fair to you because I did not offer you, at the same time, the second half of what was true. She waited. She had learned, at 22, that when a man of consequence began a sentence with "there is something I have not told you," the wisest thing a wife could do was wait for the whole sentence to arrive. The second half, Adrian said, is that Selim has never been wrong. In 19 years. Not once. He was chosen for me by my Uncle Cedric, who told me that a bird chosen by a Halloway is not, in the way of other birds, a possession. He said that a Halloway falcon is a witness. He said that if the falcon ever chose a shoulder that was not mine, I was to consider it the most important opinion I would ever receive from anyone in my life, and I was to act on it, and I was not to hesitate. He paused. I acted on it. I did not hesitate. But I told you when I acted that I was acting on observation. That was not the whole truth. I was acting on a promise I made to a dying man at 19. I did not tell you because I did not, at the time, know you well enough to trust you with it. I do now. Alys looked at him. She said, in the plain voice she had used all her life, Adrian. Thank you for telling me. She looked down at her hands. She looked back up. I have something to tell you, she said, which is smaller but which is fair. Adrian nodded. My mother, Alys said, when she sent me to Ravensworth Hall, told me one thing and one thing only. She told me, never accept the first offer without a term of your own. My term, in the housekeeper's parlor, was that you would leave a room if I asked you to leave it. I have not, in 7 weeks, asked you to leave a room. I do not, tonight, ask you to leave this one. I say only that the term still stands, and that I know you will honor it, and that I am glad, tonight, that I do not have to use it. Adrian did not answer for some moments. When he did, he said, Alys, I would leave any room in this house at your word. I hope, in this life, never to be asked to. They did not, that evening, do anything more than finish their tea in the low firelight of the morning parlor, and rise, at their own hours, to their separate rooms in the west and east wings. But the small round table stayed from that night in the morning parlor. It was never returned to the state dining room in either of their lifetimes. Mrs. Baird, in her parlor, laid down her account book at 10:30 that night and did not, for several minutes, take it up again. The falconer's boy, in the mews, gave Selim a piece of quail heart at the customary hour and said, quietly, to the bird, I hope you know what you did. Selim, who did, in fact, know, blinked once and settled. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. 2 nights after that dinner, at 11 o'clock, Adrian walked from his study through the corridor toward the west stair, and passed, at the corner of the west corridor, the open door of Alys's small sitting room, in which she was seated at the walnut desk writing, in her plain hand, a letter to a widowed neighbor in Foxcombe. She heard his step and looked up, without alarm. He said, May I come in for a moment? Yes. He came in. He did not sit. He said, I would like, tomorrow evening, to walk with you through the west garden after dinner. If you would, I would. Thank you. He did not, that night, do anything more than nod, and go on to the west stair, and continue to his own rooms. But in the morning, when Alys opened her walnut desk to continue the letter to the widowed neighbor, she found, laid across the top of the blotter, a single, small, quiet gift. A plain silver ring, not to be worn on the wedding finger, but a smaller ring, engraved on the inside with 3 words in a hand she recognized as her husband's, for being seen. She did not, that morning, put the ring on. She did, however, at 10:30, thread it onto a thin silver chain that had belonged to her mother, and she wore it at her throat, under the high linen collar of her dove-gray morning gown, where no one at Ravensworth Hall could see it except the person for whom it had been made. She wore it, from that morning, every day of her life. The London season opened at the end of April, and the Halloways, for the first time in 7 years, went up to town. It was not, on Adrian's part, an act of society. It was an act of protection. He had understood, from a letter that had arrived at Ravensworth Hall in the 2nd week of March, and from 3 further letters that had followed it in the 2nd and 3rd weeks, that Lady Isolde Marchmont had spent the winter in Foxcombe and London telling, to any drawing-room that would receive her, a version of the events of the previous October in which a duke had been unfortunately imposed upon by a maidservant of low character and cunning arrangement, and in which the correct outcome, of the season had been regrettably and improperly prevented. The letters had said, in the polite language of London, that if the Duke of Ravensworth intended to be seen in society at all, he had better be seen soon, and had better be seen with his wife on his arm, and had better be seen with her in a manner that made it impossible for the story Lady Isolde had spent the winter placing to survive the first week of the season. Adrian read the third letter twice. He then rode into Foxcombe and spoke with his grandmother. The dowager, at 84, looked at him across her small blue morning room and said, "You will go up. You will take her with you. You will present her at the Marchioness of Ashcombe's ball on the 10th of May. You will not, under any circumstances, put her in a gold gown. You will not, under any circumstances, allow her to be dressed as an imitation of Isolde Marchmont. You will let her go up as what she is, which is a Duchess of Ravensworth in the plain, quietly cut, jewel-toned wool and silk of a woman who does not need to compete. Yes, and Adrian. Yes, grandmother. You will tell her before you go. All of it. Isolde. The letter. The story. Tell her plainly. Do not go up with her in the dark. She has earned the light." He told Alys the following evening, at the small round table in the morning parlor, in the same even voice with which he had, 7 months earlier, offered her the marriage. Alys listened without interrupting. When he had finished, she said, "Very well, Adrian. When do we leave?" "On the 28th. Then I will need," she said, "a gown of a color that does not compete with Lady Isolde's gold. And I will need," she added, "to be permitted to write my own list of what is required, because I have been dressed by London once, and I know now what the London seamstresses believe a duchess ought to want, and it is not, on the whole, what a Duchess of Ravensworth ought to want." Adrian said, "Write your list." She wrote it. It contained 4 gowns, a plain deep blue wool for the daytime, a plain dark green silk for smaller evenings, a dove-gray silk for the Marchioness's ball, and a plain dark plum silk for the last week of the season. All 4 were long-sleeved, high-necked, floor-length, and cut simply. All 4 cost, together, less than a single one of the 4 gowns the London seamstresses had, in October, arrived with unsolicited. The dowager, when she saw the list, permitted herself, at the corner of her mouth, the third small precise smile of her tenure as Adrian's grandmother. They arrived in London on the 28th of April. They took Halloway House in Berkeley Square. Adrian went on the second morning to his club. Alys went on the second morning to a small circulating library in South Audley Street, of which she had heard in one of her father's old letters, and she borrowed 3 books and paid a subscription with her own money. Lady Isolde was, by then, everywhere. She was at the Argyle Rooms on the 3rd evening. She was at Lady Sefton's card party on the 5th. She was at the Marchioness of Ashcombe's smaller drum on the 7th. She wore, at each, a version of the same gold-lit gown, and she said at each some version of the same 3 sentences, that the new Duchess of Ravensworth was, regrettably, in no position to be received, that the marriage was, regrettably, not one his Grace's family had endorsed, and that one had heard the girl had been, until a very short time ago, a housemaid, though of course one did not, on principle, retail such things. At the 3rd of these evenings, at Lady Sefton's card party, she said the 3rd sentence within earshot of the dowager, who had come up from Foxcombe for a fortnight and who was standing, unseen, behind a pillar. The dowager did not, at Lady Sefton's, respond. She waited. On the 9th of May, in the afternoon, Adrian and Alys received, in Halloway House, a formal card of invitation from the Marchioness of Ashcombe for the ball of the following evening. Alys wore the dove-gray silk. It was cut simply. Its sleeves were long, its collar was high, its hem was floor-length. It was, at first glance, an underdressed gown for a Marchioness's ball. It was, at second glance, exactly the gown a woman would wear who did not need to compete, and who was in the room that evening for a reason other than being looked at. At her throat, under the high linen collar, she wore, on its thin silver chain, the plain silver ring engraved for being seen. They arrived at Ashcombe House at 9:30. The Marchioness of Ashcombe, who was one of the dowager's oldest friends and who had known Adrian since he was 6, received them in the receiving line as though she had been waiting for them to arrive at her ball for 8 years, which in fact she had. She kissed Alys on both cheeks. She turned then deliberately to Lady Isolde Marchmont, who was standing 3 places along, and she said, In a voice that carried, without appearing to try, to the far end of the ballroom, Isolde, dear. Have you met the Duchess of Ravensworth? Lady Isolde said, we have not, I believe, been introduced. The Marchioness said, you have now. Lady Isolde smiled. It was a beautiful smile. It was also, as anyone who had ever watched Isolde Marchmont in a ballroom knew, the smile of a woman who had, at that moment, decided on the specific manner in which she intended to publicly humiliate the person to whom she was smiling before the end of the evening. Alys returned the smile, small, plain, unhurried, the smile of a woman who had, at 4 in the morning, carried a copper pail of water across a flagstone floor without spilling a drop, and she inclined her head very slightly, and she said, Lady Isolde, I am honored. She was not. She was, however, extremely well trained by 22 years of her mother's counsel in the discipline of not, under any circumstances at all, letting a person of consequence see the moment at which you had decided, in return, on the specific manner in which you intended to survive them. Adrian, at her elbow, looked at his wife. He did not smile. He did, however, for anyone in the receiving line who happened to be watching, and there were, in fact, a great many of them watching, place his hand once and unmistakably at the small of Alice's back, and leave it there for exactly the length of time that Lady Isolde Marchmont required to understand that the ball she had come to that evening was not, any longer, going to go the way she had spent the winter planning. The 3 weeks between the Halloways' arrival in London and the Marchioness of Ashcombe's ball were, for Alice, weeks of the most careful and least visible work of her marriage. She did not, in those weeks, attempt to be introduced to anyone Lady Isolde had already reached. She understood, from a single afternoon with the Dowager in the small green sitting-room at Halloway House on the 2nd of May, that a public opinion in London was not a wall to be pushed against. It was a river, and the correct art was not to push against the river but to allow oneself to be seen, plainly and without hurry, at the 2 or 3 bends of the river where the river was, of its own accord, going to slow down and look up. The Dowager, at 84, had been reading rivers of that kind in London drawing-rooms for 61 years, and her advice, which she gave once and did not repeat, was, do not, my dear, chase invitations. Accept only those you are given by women whose good opinion is worth the cost of accepting them. Refuse everything else politely. In 3 weeks you will have been seen by exactly the persons who need to have seen you, and by no others. Alice accepted the advice. She accepted 4 invitations in the 3 weeks, refused 11, and paid, of her own accord, 1 morning call, to the Marchioness of Ashcombe herself in the 3rd week of April, on the specific morning at which the Marchioness was known to be at home for old friends of her mother's, and at which Alice had been invited 3 days earlier, by a handwritten note that the Marchioness had, unusually, sent by a footman rather than by post. At that morning call the Marchioness of Ashcombe, who was a small woman of 67 with white hair and blue eyes and the kind of composed and unornamented dignity that Alice, in her plain grey wool morning gown, recognized across the small green drawing-room in less than a second, poured tea with her own hand and said, without any preliminary at all, Duchess, your grandmother-in-law is my oldest friend. She has told me the whole of the Falcon story. She has also told me the whole of the housemaid story. I have understood both. I have no questions. I am on your side. When Isolde Marchmont attempts, on the 10th of May, what she has been telling half of my acquaintance she intends to attempt, I will not, at my own ball, prevent her. I will permit her to attempt it because a person of her kind requires the attempt once in front of a room in order to be understood by the room. I will, however, ensure that the room is the correct room. I will ensure that your husband is standing where he can answer. And I will ensure, at the moment of his answering, that the 3rd waltz is called. That is all I promise. That is enough. Alice, at the small green tea-table, understood, in that moment, that she had been given something she had not, on entering the drawing-room, expected, the plain and unornamented friendship of an old woman who did not, in the ordinary course of London, give friendship to persons Alice's age at all. She said, Lady Ashcombe, thank you. You will thank me by wearing, on the 10th, a gown that does not compete. I intended to. Then we understand each other. They did. Alice returned to Halloway House at a little after 12. She did not, on returning, tell Adrian the contents of the conversation, because it was, on reflection, a conversation between 2 women that had not, in any single sentence, required a man to be present. She did, however, at dinner that evening, say to Adrian, I called on Lady Ashcombe this morning. She was very kind. Adrian said, "She is a good woman." "Yes, she is." That was all either of them said about it for 4 days. On the 5th day, at breakfast, Adrian said, "The Marchioness of Ashcombe wrote to me this morning. She has recommended that I stand on the 10th of May at a specific point in her ballroom, and she has recommended that I dance the second, not the first, quadrille. She has not, in 21 years of writing to me, previously recommended where I should stand or which quadrille I should dance." Alys said, "How thoughtful of her." "Yes," Adrian said, "very thoughtful." He looked at his wife over the top of the coffee pot. He did not smile. He did, however, add a little cream to his coffee that he did not, in fact, take cream with, and he stirred it in a small precise circle that was, Alys understood without being told, the closest a Halloway of his particular temperament ever came to a wink. They finished breakfast in silence. 2 mornings later, Alys walked alone in Hyde Park at the unfashionable hour of 8:30, with her plain grey wool morning gown and a plain straw bonnet and no jewelry at all except the ring at her throat, and she was seen there, without appearing to court being seen, by 2 women of considerable London consequence who had risen early because their small dogs required it. Both of them, on returning to their houses, wrote notes to their sisters describing the walk. Both notes contained the same sentence. "She looked, my dear, like someone one already knew." That sentence, over the following 10 days, traveled by post the length of Berkeley Square, and by dinner time on the 9th of May it had reached, in one form or another, at least half of the persons who would, the following night, be standing in the ballroom of Ashcombe House. It had reached, among others, the Marchioness of Ashcombe herself, who read it at her breakfast table on the 9th, and permitted herself, at the corner of her mouth, a smile of the kind she had not permitted herself in London since 1811. The first blow, when it came, was small. Lady Isolde, at the end of the first quadrille, approached the little circle of women around the Duchess of Ravensworth and said, in her carrying voice, the voice pitched to be overheard by exactly the 4 women behind her, of whom 2 were widely known to gossip and 2 were widely known to repeat gossip verbatim, "Your Grace, do forgive my forwardness, but is that not the ring I saw on the finger of a maid in a Foxcombe kitchen last autumn? How touching that the Duke has permitted you to keep it." Alys, at her throat, wore the ring engraved for being seen on its silver chain, hidden beneath her high linen collar. On her finger she wore only her plain gold wedding band. There was no ring on any finger of hers that any maid in any kitchen had ever owned. Alys understood, then, that Lady Isolde had begun. She smiled the small plain smile. She said, without any hurry, "Lady Isolde, I have only the one ring on any finger. It is my wedding ring. I fear you are mistaken." Lady Isolde laughed. How charming. But of course, the 4 women behind her did not, that evening, retail the exchange. They did, however, remember it, and they did remember it in the specific way that women in London ballrooms remember things when they have decided, individually, which of the 2 women in the exchange they intend, over the following weeks, to be seen with. 2 of the 4, by the following Friday, called at Halloways House. 2 of the 4, by the following Friday, did not. This was, in London in that decade, precisely the shape by which a public opinion began. The second blow, when it came, was larger. 10 days after the Ashcombe ball, at a smaller supper at Lady Sefton's, Lady Isolde said, "In a group of 8, one does hear the most curious stories from Foxcombe. Something about the Duke's celebrated Falcon being unable to distinguish a duchess from a servant. I do not, of course, credit them, but one wonders how such stories begin." Adrian, who had been standing 4 paces away, turned his head. He said, quietly, evenly, without raising his voice at all, "They begin, Lady Isolde, in the mouths of persons who have been present at the event they subsequently misdescribe." Lady Isolde smiled. "Your Grace is severe. I am accurate. One is not, in society, always required to be both. In this house, this evening, I intend to be." Lord Percival Marchmont, from the far end of the room, laughed the same short, unpleasant laugh he had laughed in the yard at Ravensworth in October. He said, loudly enough to be heard by the 8, "Ravensworth, come. It is not, after all, unreasonable to observe that a bird has odd tastes. Even yours, perhaps especially yours, given the season." Adrian did not answer him. Alys, at Adrian's elbow, said, in her plain voice, without any raising of it at all, "Lord Percival." If your sister and yourself would prefer to discuss my husband's Falcon without my being in the room, you have only to say so. I will withdraw. It is a term of my marriage that any person in a room may ask me to leave it and I will leave. Lord Percival opened his mouth. He closed it. He did not, on that evening, ask her to leave anything. The third blow was the one Lady Isolde had been preparing since Christmas. On the 22nd of May, at the largest ball of the season, the Ashcombe Sefton double ball, held jointly in Ashcombe House and its adjoining garden, a footman placed into Lady Isolde's gloved hand at 10:15 in the evening a small folded paper. Lady Isolde read it. She smiled. She waited until the second waltz had concluded. She then walked, with unhurried grace and in her gold-lit gown, to the small raised dais at the head of the ballroom where the Marchioness of Ashcombe habitually sat when she was not receiving. And she said, in the pitched voice she had spent her entire adult life perfecting, "Lady Ashcombe, forgive me. I have this evening received, from an old friend in Foxcombe, a paper I fear I must lay before this company. It concerns the character and origin of a person present, and it is, I regret, a matter of public honor. May I read it aloud?" The ballroom, which had been chattering, did not, on the instant, quiet. It did, however, within 4 seconds, quiet by degrees, as ballrooms do when a person of Lady Isolde's carriage speaks the words public honor from a raised dais with a paper in her hand. The Marchioness of Ashcombe looked at Lady Isolde with an expression that was not, on the surface, anything at all. She said, "You may." Lady Isolde unfolded the paper. She said, in her carrying voice, "This is a signed statement from a person of Foxcombe parish. It states that the woman presently known as the Duchess of Ravensworth was, prior to her marriage, employed as a common housemaid at Ravensworth Hall for a period of 5 months, and that her employment was terminated only by the marriage itself, and that no announcement, no proper courtship, and no consent of any Halloway relation preceded the ceremony. It further states, on the authority of 2 Foxcombe witnesses, that the marriage was solemnized in a private manner unfit for the rank concerned, and that the family's late head, Sir Cedric Halloway, would, had he been living, have opposed it. I lay it before this company only that the truth may be known." The ballroom did not, at any point in this speech, breathe. Alys, at Adrian's elbow, did not move. Adrian, at Alys's elbow, turned his head very slightly toward the dowager, who was seated in the third chair to the left of the dais and who, at that instant, inclined her head 1/4 of an inch. Adrian stepped forward. He walked, without hurry, to the raised dais. He stopped 6 feet short of Lady Isolde. He did not, on ascending the dais, address her. He addressed the ballroom. Lady Isolde's smile did not, at any point in the 2 seconds before he spoke, waver. 2 seconds later it did. Adrian said, "I would like, if the company will permit, to answer Lady Isolde's paper. I would like to answer it in full, and without hurry." The Marchioness of Ashcombe said, "The company will permit." Adrian looked, for the first time in his life at a public gathering, directly at Alys. He held her gaze for the length of 1 full breath. Then he looked back at the room. "My wife," Adrian said, "was, prior to our marriage, employed as a housemaid at Ravensworth Hall. That statement is correct. It is also, as a matter of arithmetic, the only correct statement in the paper Lady Isolde has just read to you. Every other statement in that paper is either incomplete or false, and before I go further, I will explain why." He paused. "The paper says that no proper courtship preceded the marriage. That is true. I did not court my wife. I did not court her because I did not, when I proposed our marriage, know her. I proposed on the basis of a single event, an event witnessed in the yard at Ravensworth Hall by 5 persons, 3 of whom are in this room tonight, in which my Falcon, Selim, in the presence of Lady Isolde Marchmont herself, refused Lady Isolde's glove and instead chose, of his own will, and without any prompting from any human hand, the shoulder of Alys Merrow, a housemaid crossing the yard with a basket of apples. It is on that event, and on my knowledge that no bird chosen by a Halloway has ever, in 7 generations, chosen wrongly, that I offered Miss Merrow the protection of my name. Lady Isolde is correct that this is not a courtship. It is something older and, in this family, considerably more binding." He paused again. "The paper says that the marriage was solemnized in a private manner. That is also true. It was solemnized in the parish church at Foxcombe, before the Reverend Mr. Ainsley, before the Dowager Lady Halloway, before Mrs. Baird, who is housekeeper at Ravensworth and has been for 21 years, and before 2 witnesses. My grandmother, who was present, sits 3 chairs to your left. Any person here tonight who wishes to question the private character of that ceremony may address my grandmother directly. I recommend that they do so quietly. The Dowager did not, in that moment, move. She did, however, permit herself, at the corner of her mouth, the 4th small precise smile of her tenure. 2 of the 4 women behind Lady Isolde saw it. 2 turned their bodies, very slightly, in the direction of the Dowager, and away from Lady Isolde. Adrian said, "The paper says that my uncle Sir Cedric Halloway, had he been living, would have opposed the marriage." On this point Lady Isolde is not incompletely correct. She is directly and demonstrably wrong. My uncle chose Selim for me. My uncle told me, on the last conscious evening of his life, that if the Falcon ever refused a shoulder that was expected of him and chose one that was not, I was to consider that opinion the most important I would receive in my life, and I was not to hesitate. I did not. Any person in this room who wishes to consult the codicil in my uncle's will, which was witnessed at Doctors' Commons and is a matter of public record, will find that instruction placed there in his own hand. Its wording is precise. I did not, in fact, invent it this evening. I have been living by it since I was 19. He paused a 3rd time. That is all, he said, that I will say about Lady Isolde's paper as a paper. I would like now to say one thing about my wife. The ballroom was, at that moment, absolutely still. Alys stood at the elbow of no one at all because Adrian was on the dais and she was on the ballroom floor, and she was standing in her plain dove-gray silk gown, with her sleeves buttoned to the wrist, and her collar buttoned at her throat, and her hair pinned simply, and she was not, at that moment, looking at any one person in the room. She was looking quietly at her husband. He was looking quietly at her. The ring at her throat, under her linen collar, was warm. She could feel it. No one in the room could see it. Adrian said, "I chose her." He paused. "I chose her," Adrian said, "not for a dowry because she had none. I chose her not for a connection because she had none. I chose her not for a beauty of the kind society trains itself to notice, because that was not the beauty a Halloway Falcon in this family has ever been trained to notice. I chose her for a reason older than any of you in this room have been taught to name, and I chose her without hesitation, and I chose her without regret, and I will, on any evening of my life on which any person in any ballroom in England requires me to name that reason plainly, name it plainly, because a man who cannot name plainly the reason he chose his wife is a man who did not, in the truest sense, choose her at all." He stopped. He looked then, and only then, at Lady Isolde. He said quietly, "You have laid a paper before this company, Lady Isolde. I have answered it. My grandmother will not, this evening, respond to you further. I will not, this evening, respond to you further. If you wish to withdraw your paper, you may. If you do not, the company will draw its own conclusions. I recommend that you withdraw it." Lady Isolde did not, in the moment, withdraw the paper. She stood on the raised dais with the paper still open in her gloved hand, and she looked at Adrian, and she looked at the Dowager, and she looked at the Marchioness of Ashcombe, and she looked, at last, at Alys. In the 4 looks she took approximately 11 seconds, and in the 11 seconds every person in the ballroom of Ashcombe House understood, without being told, what the 4 looks were doing. They were counting. They were counting the number of persons in the room who would, on the following morning, refuse her at their doors. Adrian did not speak into the 11 seconds. The Dowager did not speak into them. The Marchioness did not. Alys did not. The room, in that 11 seconds, did what a London ballroom does when it has been given, without warning, an event whose retelling will define an entire season. It stored what it was watching in extraordinary detail for the letters that would be written the following morning between breakfast and 11. At the end of the 11 seconds, Lady Isolde folded the paper. She did not tear it. She did not throw it. She folded it, along its original creases, with the composure of a woman who has been told, once in her adult life, that beauty and connection and preparation are not, on this evening, going to be enough, and who has heard, only in that 11th second, the meaning of that sentence. She placed the folded paper on the small table beside the dais. She said, in a voice pitched no further than the dais itself, "I withdraw." She curtsied small, exact, the curtsy of a woman who has calculated exactly how much of her posture she can still afford to keep, and she stepped down from the dais and she walked without hurry past Adrian and past the Dowager and past the Marchioness and past Alys, and she left the ballroom through its western door. Lord Percival, who had been standing at the western door, went out with her. Neither of them, in either of their lifetimes, was received at Ashcombe House again. The Marchioness of Ashcombe rose. She said, without addressing anyone in particular, "The musicians will now play the third waltz. His Grace of Ravensworth will lead his wife." The musicians played. Adrian walked from the dais to Alys. He offered her his hand. Alys, in her plain dove-gray silk, with her ring at her throat, took it. They danced. They did not, in the dance, speak. They did not need to. The whole of the ballroom of Ashcombe House watched them dance the third waltz of the 22nd of May, and every person in the ballroom understood, without being told, that they were watching something they had not, in the seasons of their adult lives, expected to be permitted to watch. A man of great house and great grief, dancing with a woman he had not been raised to expect he would be permitted to choose, and choosing her, at the end of the dance, again plainly with the same hand that had rested at the small of her back in the receiving line. At the end of the waltz Adrian raised Alys's hand, and he kissed the plain gold wedding band on her finger, and he did not, at any point in the kiss, look away from her. The ballroom applauded, then. It applauded quietly at first, and then, as the two ladies in waiting to the Marchioness of Ashcombe began the applause, and as the Dowager, from her chair, inclined her head 1 full inch, it applauded in the second wave fully. Alys did not weep. She had, all her life, saved her weeping for the small hours. She did, however, on the dance floor of Ashcombe House at 10:30 on the 22nd of May, in front of the whole assembled London season, permit herself the smallest and least ornamented smile of her adult life. It lasted precisely 3 seconds. Adrian saw it. He kept it. They returned to Halloways House in Berkeley Square at a little after midnight. The house was dark, except for a single lamp in the small back parlor. The Dowager had gone, at 11, to her own house on Grosvenor Square, having said only, in Adrian's ear, at the doorway of Ashcombe House, "You may go now." "I am satisfied." Adrian led Alys into the small back parlor. He did not, on entering, ring for a servant. He did not, on entering, sit. He turned to her. He said, "Alys." She said, "Adrian." He said, "May I?" She did not, at first, understand what he was asking. She then, from the specific and quiet way in which his hand had lifted an inch toward her cheek and paused, understood. She said, "Yes." He kissed her. It was a plain kiss, without any hurry, at the corner of the mouth, and then, only after a full breath, at the mouth itself. It was the first kiss between them, and it lasted no longer than a kiss between two people who have understood each other for 7 months and have not, until that moment, been permitted to say so with anything except tea and toast and a mended cuff. When it ended, he did not step away. He said, "You wore, tonight, at your throat, something I gave you. I felt it under your collar in the waltz. Yes. It has not left your throat since November. No. You have worn it for 212 days without being asked. I have counted, too." He looked at her a long moment. He said, "Alys, in this room, at this hour, I would like to say plainly what I said at the ballroom in a public voice. I chose you. I chose you not because a bird settled on your shoulder. I chose you because a bird, having settled on your shoulder, did not, in the 7 months that followed, ever once regret it, and neither, in the 7 months that followed, did I." She looked at him. She said, in her plain voice, "Adrian, I did not, at first, believe I had been chosen. I believed I had been settled upon. Tonight, in the ballroom, I understood the difference. You did not settle upon me. You chose me. And I choose you back, in this room, at this hour, without any term but the one I named 7 months ago in a housekeeper's parlor, which was, and remains, only that a room I ask you to leave will be a room you leave. I have not, in 7 months, asked. I do not, tonight, ask. I say only that I choose you back." He did not, on hearing this, speak. He drew her against him. He held her. He did not, that evening, do anything more than hold her, because a marriage that had been founded on a bird's opinion and had spent 7 months carefully earning its own honesty was a marriage that did not, on the night of its first public vindication, require anything more than the plain fact of being held. They stood, in the lamplit parlor, for some minutes. At last Adrian said, very quietly, "Come home tomorrow." Alys said, "Yes." They left London the next morning. It was almost 11 months later, the following April, in the first true week of an English spring, that the small round table in the morning parlor at Ravensworth Hall was set for 3. The third chair was very small. It had been carried down, the previous evening, from the West Wing nursery, by the falconer's boy Tam, who was now 14 and who had, at Christmas, been formally taken into service as under-falconer at the wage of a grown man. He had set the chair, at Alys's own instruction, between her place and Adrian's, and he had not, on setting it, made any remark about the smallness of the person who was expected to fill it. Her name was Cordelia Halloway. She was 5 weeks old. She had her mother's gray eyes and her father's dark hair, and she had, on the second morning of her life, been introduced formally to a hooded falcon on his block in the mews at 8 in the morning, at which introduction the falcon had turned his head 1/4 of an inch and had settled without any further ceremony at all. Tam, who had witnessed the introduction, had said aloud to no one in particular, "Well then." Ravensworth Hall in that April was not the same house it had been the previous October. The state dining room was in use for county dinners twice a month and stood empty otherwise. The small round table in the morning parlor was set nightly for 2 and, in the last 5 weeks, occasionally for 3. The west wing roof had been reslated. The kitchen garden had a corrected herb rotation. The still-room herb jars stood in the correct order. The circulating library in Foxcombe, which had, 6 months earlier, received an anonymous donation of 40 guineas, was now open on Wednesdays as well as Saturdays. The under-falconer, Tam, had 5 siblings whose schooling was, quietly, paid for from the Duchess's own settlement. Mrs. Baird had, at Christmas, received a small pension provision for her mother-in-law that she had not, on principle, asked for and that she had not, on principle, refused. The dowager had come up from Foxcombe for a fortnight and was staying, this time, in the West guest suite that Alys had once, as a housemaid, dusted. She had, on her first morning in that suite, sat for some minutes at the window looking down at the yard, and she had, without saying so, understood exactly which small brown-haired maid had once dusted the room she was sitting in. She had permitted herself, at the corner of her mouth, the 5th small precise smile of her tenure as Adrian's grandmother, and had gone down to breakfast. Lady Isolde Marchmont had, over the winter, married a widower in Devon whose fortune was smaller than she had expected and whose temperament was larger. Her brother Lord Percival had, over the winter, quietly left London for the family's estate in the west of Ireland, where his complaints, being distributed only among 2 land agents and a groom, had been permitted, at last, to be as small as they had always been. Neither of them, in either of their subsequent lives, was received in a London ballroom of any consequence. At the small round table in the morning parlor, on that April morning, Alys sat with Cordelia in her arms and Adrian at her right hand. On the table, beside her plate, was the plain gray linen glove that Tam had cut and stitched for her 16 months earlier, and which she had, over the winter, used at last, because Selim, in the 2nd week of March, had come to her glove from Adrian's, in the yard at 6:30 in the morning, in the presence of Tam and no one else. Tam had not said anything about it either. He had only, that evening, wiped his eyes on the sleeve of his coat. Once, in the mews, when he had thought no one could see him, Adrian said, at the small round table, "Alys, yes, I would like, if you would permit, to say a thing that I said in a ballroom 11 months ago, and to say it again, in this room, at this hour, without the ballroom and without the paper and without any person to overhear it except our daughter, who will not, at 5 weeks, remember it. Say it." He looked at her. He said, "I chose you. I chose you not for a dowry because you had none. I chose you not for a connection because you had none. I chose you not for the beauty society trains itself to notice, because that was not the beauty a Halloway falcon in this family has ever been trained to notice. I chose you because you were seen, Alys, even when you thought you were invisible. And I intend, for the rest of my life, to be the person in this house who sees you first and last and most." She looked at him. She said, in her plain voice, "Adrian was raised by a woman who taught me one thing, that a woman should never accept the first offer without a term of her own. I named my term in a housekeeper's parlor 18 months ago, and I have never used it and I will never need to. I have, instead, a second term which I would like to name in this room at this hour in front of our daughter. Name it. That when Cordelia is old enough to be taken to the Mews, Alys said, I would like to be the person who takes her, and I would like Tam to be there, and I would like the Falcon to make his opinion known in the plain, unhurried way in which he has always made his opinion known in this family, and I would like our daughter to grow up knowing that in this house a person's worth was not ever decided by how loudly they were praised in a ballroom, but by how patiently they were seen in a yard. Adrian did not, in the moment, speak. He took her hand. He kissed the plain gold wedding band on her finger, once, without any hurry. He said, at last, agreed. Outside, in the Mews at that hour, Selim opened one eye and then the other, and turned his head with the slow, ceremonial precision of a creature who had, in his own long life, been permitted to make exactly one important opinion and had been, in the 18 months since, entirely vindicated by everyone in the household about it, including the falconer's boy who had, in the yard on a certain October morning, coughed once to disguise a laugh. Autumn had arrived at Ravensworth Hall, 18 months earlier, the way a landlord arrives at an unpaid door. In this April, in a small round parlor with a fire and a wife and a husband and a daughter and a housekeeper, and a boy who was now a young man, and an old woman in an upstairs guest suite, and a bird on a block in a stone mews with a slate roof that caught the first gray light. In that April, in that room, the debt the autumn had come to collect was, at last, understood to have been paid in full and to have been paid, from the very first hour, by the smallest brown-haired maid in the smallest gray gown, who had crossed the yard one morning with a basket of apples and had not, until a bird settled on her shoulder, considered herself part of the day's events. If the story stayed with you, another is already waiting, of a governess sent, in the middle of a Yorkshire winter, to a marquis's shuttered estate to catalogue a library no one had entered in 9 years, and of the disguised man she found still living inside it, who had not been seen by any woman in 11 years and who recognized her, in the doorway of the library, before she had said her name. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.